A short video highlighting some of the amazing achievements of this amazing man.
His mother got married at 13 and was illiterate, but he ended up going to Yale and becoming a brain surgeon.
Dr. Ben Carson, he is the pediatric neurosurgery division director at Johns Hopkins Hospital.
Ben Carson is not only a hero, but also a living example of the power of determination and education.
Director of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital.
In 1987, he became the first person to successfully separate Siamese twins.
I am proud to bestow the Presidential Medal of Freedom on Dr. Benjamin S. Carson, Sr.
So you got all these Democrat lawyers and you got all these Republican lawyers, and on their side wants to win. We need to get rid of that. What we need to start thinking about is how do we solve problems?
This is an American phenomenon. We take care of our home. We always have. It is not the government's responsibility. It is our responsibility as citizens.
Would you please join me and give a warm welcome to Dr. Ben Carson.
You know, Candy and I have been looking forward to coming here because the Baltimore Sun printed an article a few months ago saying that Carson's going to Illinois to speak to a hate group. And I just thought that was pretty hilarious, quite frankly. But, you know, I am just delighted to see so many people who are willing to stand up for the kinds of values that made America into a great country and have not succumbed to the secular progressives who are trying to drive God out of our land. And you know, God has always been a very important part of my life. As a youngster, I wanted to be a missionary doctor. You know, there were frequently stories in Sabbath school and church about missionary doctors. And they seemed like such incredible people. They traveled all over the world. Great personal sacrifice to bring not only physical, but mental and spiritual healing to people. They seemed like the most noble people on earth. And I decided when I was 8 years old that I would become a missionary doctor. And that continued to be my dream until I was 13. At which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, missionary doctor was out and psychiatrist was in. Now, I didn't know any psychiatrists, but on TV they seemed like rich people. You know? They drove Jaguars, had the big fancy mansions, big plush offices, and all they had to do was talk to crazy people all day. It seemed like I was doing that anyway. So I said, this is going to work out extremely well. I started reading Psychology Today. I was the local shrink in high school. Everybody brought me their problems. I would sit them down, stroke my chin, say, tell me about your mama. And I majored in psychology in college. It was great. You know, I had professors like Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud, and Erik Erikson, all these great names. And I was going to be the greatest psychiatrist the world has ever known. I went off to medical school, and then I started meeting a bunch of psychiatrists. Need I say more? Just kidding, some of my best friends are psychiatrists. But what I quickly discovered is what psychiatrists do in real life and what they do on television are two completely different things. And what they do in real life is actually a lot more important than what they do on television. They're some of the more intellectual members of the medical But it wasn't what I wanted to do. So now what? But you know, I believe God gives everybody special gifts and talents. So I stopped and I said, well, what are your special gifts and talents? And I realized that I had a lot of eye-hand coordination, the ability to think in 3 dimensions. I was a very careful person, never knocked things over and said, oops. This is a good characteristic for a brain surgeon. And I love to dissect things. And I put that all together and I said, you'd be a terrific brain surgeon. And so I became an adult neurosurgeon. But I very quickly discovered that those chronic back pain patients never got any better, no matter how good an operation you did, until they got their settlement. Whereas with the kids, you know, what you see is what you get. You know when they feel good, you know when they feel bad. And you can operate for 10, 15, 18 hours on a kid. And if you're successful, the reward may be 40, 50, 60 years of life. Whereas with an old geezer, you spend all that time operating, and they die in 5 years or something. So I like to get a big return on my investment. I'm just kidding, I like old people. I'm one of them then. But you know, what an amazing thing it is to be a member of the medical profession and to be able to operate or heal or contribute to the health of your fellow human beings. What is more important than your health? You stop and think about that. But you know, that is the reason that there was so much emphasis and so much haste on getting the Affordable Care Act through. It was not about health. It was about control. And fundamental change meant that you would change the power relationship. Traditionally, the people have been at the pinnacle of power. By allowing the government to take control of the most important thing that a person has, it places government in charge of our lives. That's what it was all about. But it's not too late to fix it. But it requires courage, understanding, and real conviction. And that's one of the reasons that Candy and I have been traveling throughout the country to remind people that the government works for us, we don't work for them. Now, it is quite possible tonight that I may say something that offends someone, because I don't believe in political correctness. I think that it is a scourge on our society. It is antithetical to one of the founding principles of our nation, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. It is a major tool of the secular progressives. You see, Saul Alinsky, in his book, Rules for Radicals, the original community organizer, communist, spent time right here in Chicago, along with others of his type. And not mentioning any names, but his number one rule, make the majority believe that their opinion is the minority opinion, and that your opinion is so far superior in numbers that they will shut up. And if you can co-opt the media in the process, you're much further ahead in the game. And that's exactly what they've done. They have beaten the American people into submission. And most people are looking around and they're just, hey, did anybody hear me? I better be careful. You know, this is not America. America was supposed to be the home of the brave. Whatever happened? But I think it's time for everybody to wake up and stop submitting to those subversives who are trying to change this nation to something that we would be ashamed to pass on to our children and our grandchildren. Interestingly enough, another of the tactics of Alinsky, divide the people. And that's why you have all the wars. Have you noticed all the wars? Last year, remember, it was the war on women that miraculously ended the day after the election. And then, you know, there was class warfare, age warfare, you name it, religious warfare, anything that you can find to drive wedges between people, because it's much easier to control segregated groups than a united group. And what we have to get people to understand is that we, the people of the United States, are not each other's enemies. The enemies are those who are trying to drive us apart. And we have to identify those and expose them. That's going to be very important. Well, you know, my dream of becoming a physician suffered a major blow when my parents got divorced. And, you know, that was a devastating thing for an 8-year-old. And if you know anybody who's considering divorce and they have children, please tell them to reconsider. You know, of course there's going to be friction in marriage. You know, it's like taking two pieces of sandpaper and rubbing them together. It's a lot of friction. But if you keep rubbing them together, it gets smooth. You know? You gotta hang in there long enough for it to get smooth. The Lord knew what he was doing when he established the institution of marriage. And he has so much respect for that institution that in the New Testament, the relationship between Christ and his people is compared to a marriage. And think about the implications of that. When people come along and try to change the definition of marriage, they are directly attacking the relationship between God and his people. And that's the reason that it's so important for them to change the definition, because if you can get rid of that, you can get rid of everything else in the Bible too. That's the whole. And of course, I was the recipient of much negative attention from the left because I believe in traditional marriage and stated such quite publicly, that it should be between a man and a woman. But you know, there are those in the secular progressive movement who I liken to a new group of mathematicians who come along and say, 2 plus 2 is 5. And the traditional mathematicians say, no, 2 plus 2 is 4. It's always been 4. It always will be 4. And the new ones say, no, we insist it's 5. So old ones say, okay, I'll tell you what, it can be 5 for you, but we're keeping it as 4. And the new ones say, no, it has to be 5 for you too. If it's not 5 for you, then you're a mathophobe. Basically, that's what we've gotten into. And then we listen to that mess. That's the problem. I mean, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And I've always said, any two people, regardless of their sexual orientation or any other orientation, can have the right to a legal document which allows them to share property and have visitation rights. But that does not require changing the definition of a fundamental pillar of society. So we just have to continue to make it clear, because they want to say that anybody who doesn't believe what they believe is a hater. Who are the haters? You know, I'm sure you've heard the story about the florist on the West Coast who refused to participate with a wedding, a same-sex wedding. And the gay community destroyed her floral practice. To me, that sounds more like hatred. That's total intolerance. And, you know, I was a little bit amused at how they tried to paint me as a homophobe. They came out with all guns blasting, blaring, trying to shut me up. And it was funny, it had the Chick-fil-A effect. Because I've been out doing public speaking for more than 20 years, getting involved with various types of community organizations, advocating for youth. And people know that I'm not a homophobe, and it just made them look like silly liars. And pretty soon they just backed off because they realized they were actually doing me a favor, so they stopped. But you know, the fact of the matter is, and I encourage people, don't be afraid of those people, because if God be for you, who can be against you? You don't have to worry about it. Well, you know, after the divorce, we ended up moving to Boston to live with my mother's older sister and brother-in-law. Typical tenement, large multifamily dwelling, boarded up windows and doors, sirens, gangs, rats, roaches, murders. I remember seeing people lying on the ground with bullet holes and stab wounds waiting to die. Both of our older cousins who we adored were killed. And I remember as a 9-year-old sitting on the ghetto stairs, looking through the building across the street out of which all the windows were broken and the sun was shining through the building, and thinking about my future, and realizing that it was unlikely that I would live to be more than 25 years of age. In the meantime, my mother was out working. She would leave the house at 5 in the morning and get back after midnight. One job after the next after the next. Because even though she only had a 3rd grade education, she didn't want to be on welfare. Because she had noticed that no one on welfare ever came off of it. She decided that she was not going to be a victim. And you know, she would go to the Goodwill. She would buy a shirt with a big hole in the elbow, get a couple of patches, put one on one elbow, one on the other elbow. People would say, "Where'd you get that shirt? I want one of those." And she'd take us out to the country early on Sunday morning, knock on the farmer's door, say, "Can we pick 4 bushels of your corn or your apples, your beans? 3 for you and 1 for us." And they always liked that deal. And she would bring the stuff home and can it. And for very little money, would have food throughout the winter. So I was just learning to be extraordinarily thrifty. Something that people seem to have forgotten. It's easier sometimes today for people to just sit down and wait for a handout. And you know, here's the problem with that. It zaps your motivation. And, you know, the people who are the real problems in our society are those smug, superior people who go along to the poor and say, "You poor little thing, you can't do anything, I'll take care of you." And all that does is make them dependent. That is the meanest, cruelest thing that you can possibly do. What we need to be doing is looking for ways to help people elevate, to help people move up, and not be dependent, to teach them the basic things about economics. You know, what I've told many, particularly in the black community, and I'm so glad to see the Alliance of African American Ministers to stand up against the homosexual community. You know, I think that's, but, you know, I think it is important to distinguish, because the gay community would have everyone believe that because you're opposed to gay marriage, that you hate homosexuals. And that is not true at all. Jesus, if he were here today, would not approve of gay marriage, but he would love homosexuals, and we should do the same thing. But in the black communities, you know, I've been talking to the young people, particularly to the young women, about having respect for themselves and not letting somebody come along and get them pregnant and end their educational pursuits and consign their baby to poverty. And I've been talking to the young men about having pride in themselves and in their progeny, and not fathering a child who's likely to live in poverty and whose social economic status is likely to devolve rather than evolve. And I've been talking to people about turning the dollar over in your own community a couple of times before you send it out, and that's how you build economic power, and reaching back and bringing others up with you. These are the kinds of things that the so-called leaders in the black community should be talking about, instead of victimhood and keeping people in a subservient position so you can cultivate their votes. And I think that some of the people in the black community are waking up, and they're no longer going to stay on that plantation. Well, at any rate, I must say that as a youngster, there was one thing that I really hated. You know, some people hate spiders, snakes, scorpions. I hated poverty. I thought there was a mistake. I wasn't supposed to be poor. Something happened. I got born in the wrong situation. I just really did not like it. But, you know, my mother figured if she worked long and hard enough, eventually we'd be able to move back to Detroit, and we were, in fact, able to do so. Still in a horrible neighborhood. And I was a 5th grade student. I was the worst student you've ever seen. I thought I was really, really stupid. And all my classmates were in complete agreement with that. And most of the teachers were as well. And but I got to tell you, I really did admire the smart students. You know, the teacher would ask a question, up their hand would go. And I was saying, wow, how do they know so much stuff? They're the same age as I am. Why do they know all this stuff? I don't know. I've never heard of this stuff. And but I would never tell them how much I admired them. But the kind of student that I was reminds me so much of some of the students that I see today, and some of the adults for that matter, who really don't seem to have much of a depth of knowledge. It's very superficial. But you know, some years ago there was a survey done looking at the ability of 8th grade equivalents to solve so-called complex math and science problems. 22 countries, we were one of them. We came in number 21 out of 22. Barely beat out number 22, it was neck and neck. 3rd world country. That's a serious problem, because we now live in the technological age, the information age. Think about the implications of that. Now, it is true that we are the pinnacle nation in the world. Not the first pinnacle nation, there have been others before us. Ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Great Britain, France, Spain. Number one, going to be there forever, they thought. What happened to each of them? Same thing. They became enamored of sports, entertainment, lifestyles of the rich and famous. They tolerated corruption, they lost their moral compass, and they went right down the tubes. And some people say that can't happen to the United States. But I think an honest appraisal would demonstrate that it's already happening in spades. And the question is, can we stop it? Can we be the first pinnacle nation in the history of the world to learn from the mistakes of others and to reverse course? And I think we can do it. But you know, it is a real problem. 30% of people who enter high school in this country don't graduate. 40% of people who go to college on a 4-year program wind up taking more than 4 years. Think about that. I was talking to the chairman of Intel, and he said they have a lot of tech jobs, but we don't have enough graduates, colleges in the United States to fill them. So they have to go to China, Japan, and South Korea, India, Pakistan, to get the people to fill these high-paying jobs. And we're always hearing about how our college graduates can't find work. Well, maybe we need to guide them in the right direction. Maybe the high school counselors need to start telling people we live in a technological age, the information age. Maybe we don't need as many international studies majors and philosophy and history majors. Maybe we need more physics majors and computer science majors. Maybe we need to adjust to the times that we're in. These are important concepts, and they mean the difference between a woeful existence and being able to change successfully with the times. You know, and that seems to filter up the chain. And we end up with people in leadership positions who don't understand what it means to be in a technological age. That's why they killed the space program. You know, we've had so many inventions that came out of the space program that affect our everyday lives. They have nothing to do with walking on Mars, but they've forgotten that. They don't understand that concept. The space program was for technology and innovation that completely transformed a lot of aspects of our lives. They don't understand that. They don't understand that we have in this nation more energy than we can possibly use up. We have 8 times more energy than they have in Saudi Arabia. And the Environmental Protection Agency doesn't know what it's there for. We're supposed to be using our knowledge and our technology in order to be able to harvest this energy in a safe and effective way, not shut it down. That is just stupidity. Well, it wasn't always like that. There was a time when we had the best public education system on the planet. And in 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville came to America, wanted to study it. The Europeans were just fascinated. How could a fledgling nation, barely 50 years old, already be competing with them on virtually every level? I mean, that's impossible. Nothing like that had ever happened before in the history of the world. De Tocqueville was going to come over here and figure it all out. And he studied our government, was duly impressed. He said, let me look at their education system. And that really blew his socks off. He said, he saw that anybody finishing his 2nd grade was completely literate. He could find a beaver trapper on the outskirts of society. The guy could read the newspaper, could have a political discussion, could tell them how the government worked. In Europe, only the aristocracy could do that. That was the reason that those pioneers were able to forge their way across a rugged and hostile land from one coast to the other, because they knew how to build structurally sound bridges. And they
They knew how to build dams. And they knew how to build storage facilities, and they knew how to invent things when a problem came up because they were well educated. If you really want to be blown away, look at the education chapter in our latest book, America the Beautiful. And by the way, the first 4 books I wrote with professional co-writers. The latest book, America the Beautiful, I wrote with my wife. And it's the first one ever that hit #1 in the New York Times bestseller. Education chapter, we extracted from it questions from a middle school exit exam from the mid-1800s. Most college graduates today would not be able to pass that exam. We have dumbed things down to that level. But we can get them back up. Because, again, going back to what I mentioned before, we now live in the technological age, the information age. There are computer programs that exist now that can look at the what you solve a math problem and can figure out what you don't know and tutor you, which is the same thing that a good teacher can do. But you put those on every desk in the classroom, have a teacher there to resolve problems. You can go much faster. And you don't hold back one student because of another student. With virtual classrooms, you'll be able to take the very best teachers in the world and put them in front of 1 million students instead of 30 students. There'll be lots of ways that this technology can be used if we understand how to do it, and we can catch up very, very quickly, particularly if we begin to teach some principles along with the facts. And get back to a place where our students begin to value the people around you, begin to understand that they fit into a larger puzzle, that they're not an island unto themselves, and that that's why we're called the United States of America. We have to start having our people understand those kinds of things again. And we have to put some spirituality back into what they hear. Because if you remove God and godly principles, it leaves a void. And that void will be filled by something. And that thing that it is filled by is the kind of thing that leads to all the murders that we see, wanton violence, theft, disrespect, selfishness. We don't teach that those things are wrong because political correctness says, how can you get to decide what's right? Well, I agree with them on that. We don't get to decide what's right. God gets to decide what's right. She was always saying, Benjamin, you're much too smart to be bringing home grades like this. I brought it home anyway, but she was always saying, she was always encouraging me, saying, you're really smart, you know? But it just wasn't working out, and so she prayed. And she asked God to give her the wisdom to know what to do to get her young sons to understand the importance of intellectual development. And you know what? God gave her the wisdom. At least in her opinion. My brother and I didn't think it was all that wise. And turning off the TV, what kind of wisdom is that? As far as we were concerned, it was child abuse. But in addition to that, we had to read 2 books apiece from the Detroit public libraries and submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. She would put check marks and highlights, underlines, and stuff. We would think she was reading them, but she wasn't. But we had to do it. People were always saying, oh, well, why did you read the books? Your mother was always out working. Believe me, she would have known if you didn't read the books and do the reports. And back in those days, you had to do what your parents told you. There was no social psychologist saying, let the kid trust themselves. an amazing responsibility in guiding those children. And if you're not going to exercise that responsibility, then don't have the children. That's what they need to be thinking about. And we need to think about what a precious gift a child is. When I say that, I mean any child. Who are we to determine that one's life is less important than another? And to massively kill babies who are in the womb, who are in the safest place on earth, to invade that place and slaughter them by sticking instruments into their brains and spinal cord. Can you imagine anything more barbaric than that? And we talk about other people being heathen. If they saw what we were doing, they would say, my God, I hope we never get to that place. This is what's happened in our country, and people don't even realize the barbaric nature of who we have become, because we put on our nice clothes and look at ourselves in the mirror and say how wonderful we are, when we're as bad as the worst barbarians that ever existed in the world. We have to stop that hypocrisy. And we have to make that known to everybody in our society, that every life is precious. Interestingly enough, as I started reading those books, I started discovering new things. I started knowing things. And the teacher would ask a question, and the smart kids would raise their hands, and I would say, you know, I knew the answer to that. I could have answered that question. And within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class. Much to the consternation of a lot of those students who used to laugh and call me names. They were now coming to me saying, Benny, how do you work this problem? And I'd say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious. It sure felt good to say that to those turkeys, but I had a revelation. I had the same brain, but a different attitude. And really, that's what's so important. We have to change the attitudes of people. We have to get people to understand, as I did, that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. It's not the environment. And as I began to read stories about people of great accomplishment, and I began to understand that, something magical happened. I no longer mind being poor. It didn't bother me anymore to be poor. Because I knew it was only temporary. Because I knew I had the power to change that. And you know, when you have the power to change something, it changes your attitude. And I can tell you tonight that we have the power to change the direction of this country. It is that right there. Being courageous. It's a matter of standing up. You think about Nathan Hale. He's a teenage rebel fighting for the freedom of his country, and before he was executed in his early 20s, he said, my only regret is that I have but one life to lose for my country. That's courage. Patrick Henry, give me liberty, or give me death. Think about the courage manifested by those individuals. You think about George Washington. He didn't want to be president, but he took on duties. Before that time, as a courageous general, fighting side by side with his men, led a ragtag bunch of militiamen in a war against the mightiest empire on earth. won. And why did he win? Because he believed in God. He believed that God was by his side. And when you read America the Beautiful, you read some of George Washington's quotes, because, see, a lot of the people who have rewritten history have tried to tell you that our founding fathers were not real Christians. They were deists. They didn't believe that God had an active role in our lives. You read George Washington's quotes, you will see that he truly believed that. And you look at the things that God did in our country. You know, during the Battle of Monongahela, during the French and Indian War, George Washington was a courier for General Braddock. And all the couriers were killed. They were all shot. George Washington had 2 horses shot from beneath him. His overcoat had 4 bullet holes in it. And some years later, one of the Indian chiefs heard Washington was in the area. He hadn't quite been made president yet. But he made a long journey. He wanted to meet him. He said, "Sir, I'm an expert marksman, and I shot you several times. And my men shot you several times. And after a while, I told them, just stop shooting at that guy. You're just wasting your bullets. He's not going to go down. And sir, I just wanted to come and pay homage to a man who was protected great spirit above and will become the father of a great nation." And you know, that story used to be in all the American history books until 1935, when political correctness started creeping in and said you can't put anything like that in there. And if you look to the British war records, you will find accounts of the times when people like General Howe had almost trapped Washington and his men. And they were up against a river, a raging river. And the river would recede, and Washington's men would go across. And by the time the British got there, the river was raging again. This happened on several occasions, documented in the British literature. And you want to tell me that God was not looking out for this country? When Washington was down to his last battalion of men, and they were trapped on Long Island. And the British had an armada, one of the largest armadas ever assembled from the water. And the battalions were closing in from the land. And it looked like the end for Washington's 5,000 last troops. Meteorological records demonstrate that that night, a mysterious thick fog came down and shielded the escape of Washington and his men. And you want to say that God does not love this country. And it was that love that allowed this country to reach the pinnacle of the world much faster than any other nation in the history of the world. But if we reject God and we throw him out, we will descend just as rapidly. We have to remember that we are one nation under God. And we cannot let the secular progressives win this fight. Because if we do, our country will be destroyed. Gotten myself together academically, life was going to be good for me wrong. I had another problem. I had bad temper. I was one of those people who thought they had a lot of rights. You familiar with anybody like that? The more rights you think you have, the more likely someone is to infringe upon them. People are always infringing on my rights. On my rights. I remember once a fellow hit me with a pebble. It didn't hurt, but I was incensed that he would dare hit me with a pebble. And I picked up a large rock, hurled it at his face, broke his glasses, almost put his eye out. Another time, a fellow was trying to close my locker at school. I wanted to close it. I socked him in the forehead with my fist. Unfortunately, still had the lock in my hand, put a 3-inch gash in his forehead. My mother was trying to get me to wear something. I picked up a hammer, tried to hit her in the head with it. Fortunately, my brother caught it from behind. Other than that, I was a pretty good kid. But you can see that, that temper can really create problems. When I was 14, another youngster angered me. I had a large camping knife. I tried to stab him in the abdomen. Fortunately, under his clothing, he had a large metal belt buckle.
The knife blade struck it and it broke, and he fled in terror. But I was more terrified than he, as I recognized that I was trying to kill somebody over nothing. And I locked myself in the bathroom and started contemplating. I said, you know, if he had not had that belt buckle on, I would have been on my way to jail or reform school. Never to realize my dream of becoming a physician. And I just fell on my knees and I said, Lord, I cannot control my temper. You have to help me, or it's over for me. And there was a Bible, and I picked it up and opened it to the book of Proverbs. There were all those verses in there about fools. And it looked like they were all written about me. There were also verses about anger, like Proverbs 19:19. There's no point getting an angry man out of trouble because he's just going to get right back into it. But encouraging verses like Proverbs 16:32. Mightier is the man who can control his temper than the man who can conquer a city. And I stayed in that bathroom for 3 hours, reading, contemplating, and praying. And I came to an understanding that to get angry, to punch someone in the face, to kick down a door was not a sign of strength. It was a sign of weakness. It meant that you could easily be manipulated and controlled by others. I also came to understand that being angry all the time meant that you were selfish. Because you were angry because somebody was in your space. Somebody took your thing. Somebody did something to me. I, me, all the center of anger. And if you could step out of the center of that circle, then you could learn how to control it. And when I exited that bathroom 3 hours later, the temper was gone. And I've never had another problem with it since that day. And some people say, you just learn how to hide it. But I'll tell you something, when God fixes a problem, he doesn't just paint over the top. He fixes it. A lot of people can't believe that I used to have a temper because they know me now. But you know, that calmness is good. Because another one of Saul Alinsky's rules: demonize your opponents, attack them, get them to react, because they're likely to make a mistake when they react, and then you can use that against them. And I'll tell you, the secular progressives hate it when you just calmly stare them down. And you say, now that you've completed your gratuitous attack, can we get back to the subject at hand? Oh, boy, I don't like that at all. But that's what it takes, because we're fighting for the hearts and minds of the people of America. And I'll tell you something, the last national election, tens of millions of people did not vote. And I'm encountering a lot of those people. And they're telling me they didn't vote because they had given up on America. But now they're starting to be encouraged again. And it's going to require every one of us in our sphere of influence to be willing to stand up for what we believe. And in closing, Alexis Tocqueville, when he finished his analysis of America, he was duly impressed by the fact that in our schools we taught values and principles, and we used the Bible. And he said, America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. And I want you to realize the next time you sing our national anthem, and you get to the last line, the land of the free and the home of the brave, you will realize that we cannot be free unless we're brave. Thank you.